President Trump signed an executive order declaring it a WMD, saying it poses a threat more comparable to a chemical weapon than a narcotic.
At 6 o'clock, federal agents were already moving on a threat that had been growing quietly inside the country. What looked like ordinary homes, rural properties, and quiet roads had been hiding something far more dangerous, and the scale of what was uncovered would soon force Washington to pay attention. Federal authorities later confirmed that coordinated operations by the Drug Enforcement Administration and Immigration and Customs Enforcement had dismantled 2 major drug trafficking networks operating in Washington state with direct links to the Sinaloa cartel, one of the most powerful transnational criminal organizations in the world. The case did not begin with a border chase or a cartel shootout, but it quickly revealed how deeply organized drug networks have embedded themselves far beyond the southern frontier. Officials described the operation as strategic in nature rather than routine law enforcement, after investigators uncovered large quantities of fentanyl, firearms, and cash capable of causing widespread harm across American communities. What emerged was not a street-level crime story, but a warning about how modern cartels operate inside the United States, a reality that becomes clearer as the details of the investigation come into focus. If you want to understand how operations like this unfold, why they matter, and what they signal about the direction of American security policy, subscribe to Military Power, because this story is only beginning, and the next phase explains how this threat was built from the ground up. Federal investigators described the seizure as significant because the volume of fentanyl involved pushed the case far beyond street-level drug crime and into the category of industrial-scale distribution. Authorities confirmed that roughly 3.4 million potential fentanyl doses were removed from circulation, along with large amounts of cash and multiple firearms, which together revealed a system designed to move lethal substances efficiently and repeatedly, rather than through isolated transactions. The combination of drugs, weapons, and money indicated a structure that treated narcotics trafficking as a business operation with logistics, security, and financial planning. Fentanyl's danger lies in its extreme potency, which makes even a small measurement capable of causing death within minutes. Medical data and law enforcement assessments show that just a few milligrams can be fatal, meaning the quantities recovered in Washington represented not abstract statistics, but a real and immediate threat to human life. When investigators translated the raw weight of seized fentanyl into potential doses, the numbers reached levels associated with mass casualty risk, reinforcing why officials framed the operation as a public safety intervention rather than a routine bust. Public health agencies have repeatedly warned that fentanyl has altered the drug landscape because it spreads rapidly through existing markets and overwhelms emergency response systems. Hospitals, first responders, and local governments face strain when overdoses spike, and communities experience long-term consequences that extend beyond individual users. By removing such a large quantity from circulation at once, authorities disrupted not only supply but also the predictable cycle of addiction, medical emergencies, and community harm that follows large-scale distribution. The presence of large cash reserves added another layer to the threat assessment because it demonstrated how quickly profits were being generated and recycled back into criminal activity. Cash on this scale supports continued production, expanded distribution routes, and the recruitment of additional participants, allowing networks to grow quietly without relying on traditional financial systems. In this case, money functioned as both evidence of past harm and fuel for future operations, which explains why financial seizures are treated as strategically important alongside drugs themselves. Weapons recovered during the raids further elevated concerns among federal planners. Firearms are not incidental in large drug operations, as they protect supply lines, enforce discipline, and deter rivals or interference. The mix of weapons found alongside narcotics suggested preparation for violence if the operation was challenged, highlighting how modern trafficking networks increasingly resemble organized security units rather than loose criminal groups. This intersection of drugs and firepower is one reason federal agencies classify such cases as high risk. Beyond fentanyl, agents also seized other controlled substances, including methamphetamine, heroin, and cocaine, which illustrated a diversified distribution strategy. By offering multiple drugs, networks reduce dependence on a single product while widening their customer base, a method that stabilizes income even when enforcement pressure increases. This diversification mirrors legitimate market behavior and underscores how sophisticated these operations have become. These patterns help explain why federal officials treat such seizures as indicators of broader structural risk rather than isolated criminal episodes affecting only individual offenders. Taken together, the volume and variety of seized materials painted a picture of sustained harm rather than episodic crime. Each category of evidence reinforced the same conclusion, which was that the operation posed a broad threat to community safety and public health. As investigators prepared to move deeper into the case, these numbers served as the foundation for understanding why the response escalated beyond local enforcement and into a coordinated federal effort that reflected the seriousness of the threat now facing American communities. The first network came to light through an event that appeared routine and unremarkable, yet it revealed how fragile the line can be between normal daily life and organized crime. A local traffic stop led officers to discover fentanyl, drug powder, and cash inside a vehicle, an encounter that initially looked like a small-scale offense, but quickly raised questions about supply, distribution, and intent. What mattered was not only what was found, but the indicators that suggested this load was part of something far larger and more organized. Federal authorities recognized early that the materials recovered pointed toward a coordinated operation rather than an isolated courier. This realization triggered a broader response, and over the following months, the case expanded into a 10-month federal investigation involving the Drug Enforcement Administration, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and regional task forces. Each agency brought a different capability, allowing investigators to examine the network from multiple angles while maintaining operational secrecy. During this period, agents focused on understanding how the network functioned rather than moving immediately to arrests. Undercover purchases helped establish patterns of supply, while surveillance clarified how members communicated and moved product across neighborhoods. Financial analysis played a central role, as investigators traced cash flows that revealed laundering activity designed to convert drug proceeds into usable income. This slow and methodical approach allowed authorities to build a comprehensive picture of the organization without alerting those involved. What emerged was a family-run structure that relied on trust and familiarity to reduce exposure. Relatives handled storage, transportation, and payment collection, creating a closed loop that limited outside access and made infiltration difficult. This model allowed the group to operate quietly within middle-class residential areas, where steady routines and familiar faces drew little attention. Neighbors saw families going to work and children attending school, unaware that fentanyl distribution was occurring nearby. The choice of location was deliberate. Suburban communities provided anonymity, stable infrastructure, and access to transportation corridors, all of which supported consistent delivery schedules. Unlike urban hotspots that attract frequent patrols, these neighborhoods offered a lower-profile environment that reduced the risk of casual detection. Investigators later concluded that this setting was a strategic decision rather than coincidence. As evidence accumulated, federal planners coordinated a series of simultaneous raids designed to prevent escape or destruction of evidence. Timing was critical, as the network relied on multiple locations that functioned together. By acting at once, agents were able to seize drugs, cash, and records that confirmed the scale of operations and the duration of activity. The arrests marked the visible end of a process that had been unfolding quietly for months. The significance of this case lies in how it illustrates the evolution of modern drug trafficking inside the United States. Instead of relying on overt violence or street-level presence, the network emphasized discretion, routine, and family ties. This approach made detection more difficult and prolonged the period during which harmful substances circulated through local markets. For federal authorities, the investigation served as a reminder that major trafficking operations often begin with minor encounters that reveal deeper structures. The traffic stop did not end the threat on its own, but it provided the thread that investigators were able to follow patiently. That process would later inform how officials approached the broader campaign against similar networks operating across the country. The outcome underscored how small enforcement actions can escalate into national cases when data, patience, and coordination are applied consistently over time across multiple jurisdictions nationwide in practice. The second network raised greater alarm among federal planners because it combined drugs, weapons, and financial crimes within a single rural base. Investigators viewed this as escalation rather than expansion. It showed how organized trafficking had moved beyond concealment and into consolidation, creating a physical footprint with operational significance nationally. This network operated from a rural property in Washington state, an environment that offered distance from dense oversight and a sense of isolation. Officials noted that rural settings can delay detection while enabling storage and movement at scale. The choice reflected confidence and risk tolerance rather than caution by design. Authorities later confirmed that the site supported drug distribution alongside weapons possession and money laundering activity, a combination that heightened federal concern. Each category reinforced the others, forming a closed ecosystem of crime. This convergence increased the potential for violence and financial resilience, raising the stakes for surrounding communities nationwide. Illegal cockfighting served as a visible activity that masked broader criminal exposure without drawing immediate suspicion. Such events create routine traffic and cash flow that appear local rather than organized. Investigators assess this cover as practical rather than innovative, yet effective in reducing scrutiny over long periods of time carefully. When federal teams moved on the property, the findings confirmed fears that the location functioned as more than storage. Large quantities of fentanyl were present alongside dozens of firearms and an improvised explosive device. This combination signaled preparedness for confrontation, not merely concealment, and demanded an escalated security response posture. Federal officials avoided characterizing the site as a battlefield, yet its contents required planning consistent with high-risk operations. The presence of explosives altered how agencies approached the scene. Safety of personnel and nearby residents became a primary concern, reinforcing the seriousness of the threat posed by entrenched trafficking nodes. Analysts noted that the layout and resources reflected tradecraft refined by Mexican cartels over decades. These methods emphasized durability, redundancy, and intimidation without constant visibility. Finding such characteristics in rural Washington underscored how transnational, criminal organizations adapt foreign experience to domestic environments with alarming efficiency across the United States. Today, this case also challenged assumptions that major cartel infrastructure remains concentrated near borders or large cities. Rural placement demonstrated strategic flexibility and confidence. It suggested that enforcement pressure elsewhere may push networks to experiment with geography, complicating detection and response for agencies accustomed to traditional patterns of organized crime activity. For surrounding communities, the discovery was a reminder that perceived safety does not guarantee insulation from organized crime. Quiet landscapes can host serious threats without obvious warning signs. This realization has influenced how federal agencies communicate risk and coordinate with local partners following major interdictions across affected regions nationwide now. Taken together, the second network represented a sharper phase of the threat facing the United States. It demonstrated escalation in confidence, capability, and risk acceptance. As authorities assessed the outcome, attention began shifting toward what such entrenched sites reveal about the future trajectory of cartel activity within American territory broadly. From a strategic perspective, the rural compound highlighted how criminal enterprises test boundaries of jurisdiction and response. Multiple agencies had to coordinate under pressure while managing uncertainty. The case reinforced the need for intelligence sharing and flexible planning when confronting complex threats that do not fit familiar profiles anymore today. Ultimately, the exposure of this network expanded understanding of cartel presence inside the country. It set the stage for broader federal action without revealing its full scope yet. What followed would depend on lessons drawn from this escalation and how seriously policymakers choose to respond in coming months ahead nationally. Federal officials framed the impact of these arrests and seizures in human terms because the numbers involved translate directly into lives saved. By removing millions of potential fentanyl doses from circulation, authorities reduced the immediate risk of mass overdose events that have become tragically common across the United States. This was not an abstract success measured only in kilograms or dollar values, but a concrete interruption of harm that would otherwise have reached homes, hospitals, and emergency rooms nationwide. Fentanyl remains the leading cause of overdose deaths in America, surpassing car accidents and firearms in several age groups. Public health data show that tens of thousands of Americans die each year from opioid overdoses, with fentanyl involved in the vast majority of cases. Against this backdrop, every seizure represents more than enforcement activity, as it alters the statistical trajectory that communities face month after month. Large-scale removals have an outsized effect because they disrupt supply at critical moments. Medical systems experience immediate relief when fentanyl availability drops, even temporarily. Emergency departments see fewer overdose admissions, first responders face reduced call volumes, and local health resources regain limited breathing room. These effects rarely make headlines, yet they form the quiet foundation of community stability. The Washington seizures contributed to this stabilizing effect by preventing sudden spikes that often overwhelm local capacity. The impact also extends to families and workplaces in ways that are difficult to quantify, but easy to recognize. Overdose deaths often strike working-age adults, leaving behind children, financial hardship, and long-term social costs. When authorities prevent large quantities of fentanyl from reaching consumers, they interrupt cycles of loss that ripple through schools, employers, and neighborhoods. These outcomes demonstrate why officials increasingly describe drug interdiction as a form of community protection rather than punitive enforcement. At the same time, the case reshaped assumptions about where danger exists. The presence of cartel-linked activity in quiet suburbs and rural areas challenged the belief that overdose risk is confined to urban centers. Affluent neighborhoods and isolated communities were shown to be equally vulnerable, not because of local demand alone, but because distribution networks intentionally seek low visibility environments. This realization has prompted broader awareness that safety cannot be measured solely by appearance or income levels. Law enforcement agencies also evaluate success through the deterrent effect created by high-profile disruptions. Removing key supplies sends a signal that sustained operations are vulnerable to detection and dismantling. While deterrence cannot eliminate demand, it complicates planning for criminal organizations and increases uncertainty. This uncertainty slows distribution and raises internal costs, indirectly reducing the volume of drugs reaching consumers. Economic consequences further illustrate the real-world impact. Overdose deaths impose billions of dollars in lost productivity, healthcare spending, and social services each year. By preventing tens of thousands of potential overdoses, seizures of this scale reduce future burdens on public budgets. These savings rarely appear in enforcement statistics, yet they influence long-term fiscal stability at local and national levels. Community trust also factors into the assessment. Residents who see tangible reductions in harm are more likely to support prevention programs and cooperate with authorities. Trust strengthens when enforcement outcomes align with public safety rather than abstract legal victories. In Washington, the scale of the seizures helped reinforce this connection between action and protection. Taken together, the real-world impact of the operation extended well beyond arrests. It altered health outcomes, reduced immediate risk, and exposed vulnerabilities that had gone unnoticed. By interrupting the flow of fentanyl before it reached users, federal agencies demonstrated how enforcement decisions translate into measurable benefits for everyday Americans. As the country continues to confront an evolving overdose crisis, cases like this offer a clearer picture of what effective intervention looks like. The challenge ahead lies in sustaining these results while addressing the broader conditions that allow such threats to take root inside communities across the nation today. The operations carried out in Washington offered a clear example of enforcement success, yet they represented only a small segment of a much larger transnational system. Fentanyl distribution does not operate in isolation within any single state, as it is supported by global supply chains that stretch across continents and jurisdictions. From the origin of chemical inputs to their eventual arrival in American communities, each stage is shaped by international conditions, regulatory gaps, and political choices that extend far beyond local crime. Analysts have increasingly framed fentanyl trafficking as a strategic challenge rather than a series of disconnected criminal cases. The scale of deaths linked to synthetic opioids has pushed the issue into the realm of national security, where public health, border management, and law enforcement intersect. When tens of thousands of Americans die annually from overdoses, the question becomes not only who distributes the drugs, but why the system allows such volume to reach the population year after year. Federal law enforcement occupies a central role in this confrontation because of its ability to operate across state lines and coordinate intelligence. Agencies such as the Drug Enforcement Administration and Immigration and Customs Enforcement provide continuity that local departments cannot achieve alone. Their involvement reflects recognition that fragmented responses leave openings that organized networks can exploit. Coordination across agencies transforms isolated investigations into sustained pressure. Border control also remains a critical element of the broader framework. While fentanyl is often discussed as a domestic crisis, its supply depends on international movement of materials and people. Weaknesses at entry points create opportunities that ripple inward, affecting cities, suburbs, and rural areas alike. Effective border oversight therefore functions as a preventive measure rather than a symbolic gesture, reducing the volume that enforcement must later intercept inside the country. Interagency cooperation has become increasingly important as trafficking networks adapt to enforcement pressure. Information sharing between federal, state, and local partners allows patterns to be identified earlier and responses to be calibrated more precisely. When agencies compete rather than collaborate, gaps emerge that sophisticated organizations can navigate with ease. The Washington cases demonstrated the benefits of unified action, yet they also highlighted how resource-intensive such coordination can be. Political will plays a decisive role in determining whether these efforts are sustained. Enforcement operations require consistent funding, legal authority, and policy support over long periods of time. Short-term initiatives may deliver visible results, but they rarely alter underlying dynamics. A strategy aimed at dismantling supply chains demands patience and acceptance that progress may be incremental rather than immediate. Public debate often focuses on arrest numbers as a measure of success, yet this metric captures only a fraction of the challenge. Removing individuals without disrupting the broader system risks creating temporary disruption, followed by rapid replacement. Strategic effectiveness depends on whether pressure is applied across multiple layers of the supply chain simultaneously. This approach shifts attention from individual cases to structural vulnerabilities. International cooperation also shapes outcomes. Fentanyl-related supply chains cross borders that law enforcement alone cannot control. Diplomatic engagement, regulatory alignment, and shared intelligence influence whether upstream pressures are reduced or simply displaced. Without cooperation beyond national boundaries, domestic enforcement faces diminishing returns as networks adjust their routes and methods. The Washington operations therefore serve as a lens through which to view a wider national problem. They illustrate what coordinated action can achieve while underscoring the limits of enforcement acting in isolation. Each success raises expectations for follow-through at higher policy levels, where decisions about resources and priorities are made. Ultimately, the strategic question confronting the United States is not confined to how many networks are disrupted, but whether the country is prepared to sustain a comprehensive response over time. Addressing fentanyl at scale requires alignment between enforcement, border policy, and political commitment. Without that alignment, individual victories risk remaining temporary, even as the broader threat continues to evolve across American society today. The operations carried out in Washington should be understood as more than a sequence of arrests or seizures. Together, they revealed a broader pattern that shows how transnational criminal organizations have embedded themselves deep inside the United States, far from traditional border narratives. What emerged was not an isolated law enforcement story, but evidence of a persistent presence that challenges assumptions about where major security threats originate. The real significance of these actions lies in their measurable impact on human safety. By removing millions of potential fentanyl doses from circulation, authorities reduce the risk of tens of thousands of overdose deaths that would have strained families, communities, and medical systems. This outcome goes beyond enforcement statistics, as it translates into fewer emergency calls, less pressure on hospitals, and greater stability in areas that believed themselves insulated from such danger. At a political level, the case highlights how the fentanyl crisis has moved beyond the boundaries of criminal justice. It now sits at the intersection of national security, public health, and international policy. Supply chains that cross borders, financial flows that move through global systems, and enforcement challenges that span jurisdictions all point to a problem that requires coordination at the highest levels of government. As the country looks ahead, the choice is not simply about enforcement intensity, but about strategic resolve. The direction taken now will shape whether similar networks continue to find space to grow, or whether consistent pressure limits their reach before the damage becomes irreversible across American society. What happened in Washington was not an isolated case. Share your thoughts and subscribe to Military Power to stay informed on the security challenges shaping the future of the United States.